The concrete path at Centennial Park was still radiating the late July heat. 5 young men, flushed from cheap beer and inflated by unearned confidence, thought they had spotted an easy target. A tired man in a faded work shirt watching his 6-year-old son in the sandbox. They noticed the stooped shoulders and graying beard. They didn't notice the thickened cartilage of his ears. They didn't recognize the precise balance of his weight resting on the balls of his feet. They wanted to feel powerful. They had chosen the wrong day, and they had chosen the absolute wrong father. Agrippa Fisher's lower back throbbed with its familiar dull rhythm. It was a metronome of pain ticking every time he shifted his weight against the unforgiving wooden slats of the park bench. Tuesday evenings were always the hardest. The lumberyard drained whatever energy he had managed to gather over the weekend, leaving him exhausted, smelling faintly of pine resin and diesel fumes. But Tuesday was also his evening with Larry, and Larry needed the park. Agrippa watched his son through eyes narrowed against the fading sunlight. Larry was 6, small for his age, with a mop of unruly brown hair and an intense, quiet concentration. Right now, all of that focus was directed toward a bright yellow plastic dump truck he was carefully filling with sand. The boy didn't play like most children. There was no frantic running or shrieking. He built, he organized, he created order from dirt. Agrippa loved that about him, even though it worried him. The world wasn't always kind to quiet things. Agrippa rubbed his jaw, his thick, calloused fingers tracing the faint, jagged scar that curved beneath his left eye. It was a souvenir from a life that seemed to belong to someone else. A man who once stepped into steel cages beneath blinding halogen lights, breathing in the smell of canvas and sweat. A man who understood the brutal mathematics of human bodies. Now, the only math Agrippa cared about was figuring out whether his paycheck could cover Larry's new winter coat and the rising grocery bills. He leaned back and stretched his legs. His left knee popped loudly. The sound was a harsh reminder of his last professional fight 7 years earlier. A poorly checked leg kick had torn his ACL and essentially ended his career. He didn't miss the violence. He didn't miss the promoters, the weight cuts, or the taste of blood at the back of his throat. He just missed the money. The park was relatively empty. A few mothers sat near the swings, absorbed in their phones, while their toddlers moved across the rubberized mats. The air carried the scent of fresh cedar mulch mixed with the distant hum of rush-hour traffic on the interstate. It was peaceful. Or at least, it was supposed to be. The peace shattered with the harsh metallic screech of a dirt bike engine revving far too close. Agrippa didn't flinch. His eyes simply shifted toward the noise, a predatory reflex he'd spent years trying to suppress. 5 young men came over the small hill, leading toward the playground. They weren't riding the bike. One was pushing it, exhaust smoking, while the others surrounded him like a ragged, obnoxious honor guard. They appeared to be in their early 20s, old enough to know better, but young enough to believe they were invincible. They wore the uniform of suburban boredom, muscle shirts, backward caps, and expensive sneakers deliberately scuffed to look careless. The man in the center, the one pushing the bike, seemed to be the group's gravitational center. He was tall, thick around the middle, broad-shouldered, and had a loud, braying laugh that immediately irritated Agrippa. He carried a half-empty tallboy of beer loosely in his right hand. Agrippa watched them objectively. He didn't judge their clothing or their noise. He judged their mechanics. The leader walked heavily on his heels. Poor balance. The 2 on his left were jittery, talking quickly, and compensating for insecurity with unnecessary movement. The remaining 2 were quiet and lagged slightly behind. Followers. None of them looked like they'd ever taken a real punch. They dumped the dirt bike beside the playground, directly over a bed of marigolds the city had planted in spring. The leader, Trent, as Agrippa would soon hear the others call him, crushed his empty beer can and tossed it into the bushes. "Place is dead," Trent announced, his voice carrying easily across the playground. He looked around, scanning the mothers near the swings, the empty basketball court, and finally Agrippa and Larry. Agrippa didn't look away. He didn't glare either. He simply gave him a blank, unreadable stare. It was the same stare he'd once given across a referee's outstretched arm before the bell rang. Complete absence of emotion. Trent smirked, interpreting the lack of reaction as submission. He nudged the guy beside him, a skinny kid with a neck tattoo that looked like it had been done in a basement. "Watch this," Trent muttered. Agrippa sighed, letting out a long, slow breath that ruffled his mustache. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs. He didn't want this. He was exhausted. He had a half-eaten sleeve of saltines in his truck and a child who needed a proper dinner and bedtime. He just wanted the world to leave him alone for one damn hour. He glanced at Larry. The boy hadn't noticed the intrusion. He was still carefully backing his yellow truck toward a small mound of sand. Just keep walking, Agrippa thought, his eyes following Trent and his crew as they swaggered closer. Just keep walking and leave us alone. But the world, as Agrippa had learned long ago, rarely listened to what a tired man wanted. They didn't walk past. They drifted into the playground like trash blowing across an empty lot, settling exactly where they were most in the way. Trent climbed onto the backrest of an empty bench just 10 feet from Agrippa, planting his muddy sneakers on the seat. The others leaned against the chain-link fence or squatted along the plastic edge of the sandbox. The atmosphere in the park changed instantly. The mothers near the swings exchanged quick, nervous glances. Within 3 minutes, phones were tucked away, diaper bags were zipped shut, and toddlers were scooped into waiting arms. Agrippa watched them leave. He understood. When the air pressure drops, you get out of the storm's path. But Agrippa couldn't leave. Larry had finally found the perfect rhythm with his truck, and interrupting him now would mean a meltdown. Agrippa wasn't going to let 5 bored kids steal his son's happiness. He stayed on his bench, a monument in faded denim. Trent pulled a disposable vape from his pocket, took a long drag, and blew a thick cloud of artificially sweet strawberry vapor into the evening breeze. It drifted over the sandbox. Larry stopped playing, coughed softly, and waved his little hand in front of his face. Agrippa's jaw tightened. The grinding pain in his back suddenly disappeared, replaced by a cold, familiar clarity spreading from the base of his skull down his spine. "Hey!" Trent called loudly toward Agrippa. "Your kid's eating dirt!" Agrippa didn't look at him. His eyes remained on Larry. "He's fine." His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, giving nothing away. "Looks retarded." One of the followers snickered, the skinny kid with the neck tattoo. Agrippa's heart rate didn't rise. It actually slowed. This was the moment the cage door locked, the moment he realized words were quickly losing their usefulness. He shifted his footing, sliding his right foot back half an inch and planting the ball of his foot firmly against the concrete. "He's playing," Agrippa said, turning his head just enough to catch Trent in his peripheral vision. He paused. "Why don't you guys move along? Park's closed at dusk anyway." Trent hopped down from the bench. He puffed out his chest, making the classic primate display of dominance. He took 3 steps toward Agrippa and stopped just outside striking range. He was tall, maybe 6 feet 2 inches, with at least 20 pounds on Agrippa. But it was soft weight, beer and fast food, wrapped in unearned arrogance. "You telling us what to do, old man?" Trent asked, his voice mocking as he played to his audience. The other 4 chuckled and moved closer, forming a loose, ragged semicircle. "I'm telling you, you're bothering people," Agrippa said, his voice dropping an octave. "And you're blowing smoke on my son. Move along." "It's a free country, Grandpa," Trent sneered. He stepped closer. He was inside the zone now, the radius where bad things happen quickly. Agrippa's eyes mapped the geometry of the situation. Trent was the loudmouth, but his hands were low, and his chin was raised. The skinny kid on the right carried nervous energy, likely to throw a wild overhead punch. The 2 in the back were non-factors, unless things went to the ground. The 5th guy near the sandbox was the wild card. Trent looked down at Agrippa's hands. He noticed the calluses, the dirt beneath the fingernails, and the cheap digital watch. He saw a working stiff. A loser. Nice shirt, Trent said, pointing toward Agrippa's frayed flannel. Get that at the soup kitchen? Agrippa didn't answer. He was watching Trent's shoulders, the body's telegraph system. Annoyed by the lack of fear, Trent decided to push further. He turned toward the sandbox and took several steps toward Larry. Hey, kid, Trent barked. Larry froze. He looked up, his large dark eyes suddenly wide with alarm. He pulled his yellow truck tightly against his chest. Agrippa stood. He didn't jump up. He didn't spring aggressively to his feet. He simply rose, unfolding his frame with a fluid, mechanical grace that seemed completely out of place for a man who had appeared so broken moments earlier. The movement was so smooth that Trent briefly looked confused. He stopped approaching the sandbox and turned back. Don't talk to him, Agrippa said. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by a flat, deadened tone. It was the voice of a man stating a physical law of the universe. Gravity pulls down. Water is wet. Do not talk to my son. Trent's ego wouldn't allow him to retreat in front of his friends. He puffed his chest out farther, closed the distance, and stopped just a foot away. He tilted his head down to meet Agrippa's eyes. Or what? Trent challenged, his breath reeking of artificial strawberry and stale beer. You going to do something, old man? Agrippa looked at Trent, really looked at him. He saw the slight tremor in the young man's jaw, the rapid blinking, the adrenaline flooding a system that had no idea how to handle it. Trent didn't actually want to fight. He wanted Agrippa to cower. He wanted the ego rush of making a grown man back down. There's a way this goes, Agrippa said quietly, almost gently. You walk back to your bike, ride away, and wake up tomorrow feeling just fine. Trent let out a loud, disbelieving laugh and turned toward his friends. Are you hearing this guy? He thinks he's John Wick. The others laughed, encouraged by Trent's confidence. The circle tightened. They were invading Agrippa's space, cutting off his possible exits. Look at me, Agrippa said. Trent turned back, a sneer fixed across his face. I am asking you as a father to walk away, Agrippa said. It was a genuine plea. Agrippa knew what lived inside his own muscle memory. He knew the violence he was capable of, and he dreaded bringing it back to life. He hated the paperwork. He hated police questions. Most of all, he hated the thought of Larry witnessing it. But Trent mistook the plea for fear. Fuck you and your ugly kid, Trent spat. Then he made the mistake that ended the negotiation. He reached out and shoved Agrippa hard in the center of his chest. Agrippa didn't stumble. He simply absorbed the kinetic force, his weight shifting instantly backward onto his rear foot, loading the spring. The cynical audience of the world knows how this usually goes. The loudmouth pushes the quiet guy. The quiet guy takes it. The loudmouth walks away feeling like a king. But the world had just stepped into Agrippa Fisher's cage, and the cage door had just locked. Time seemed to dilate. It didn't actually slow for Agrippa. His mind simply accelerated, processing information at a rate sharpened by a decade of professional combat. Trent's shove had left him off balance. His weight was pitched entirely forward onto his lead foot, his chin hanging over his knee. His hands had dropped toward his waist, completely abandoning his guard. He was structurally compromised. Agrippa didn't feel anger. Anger made you sloppy. Anger made you swing wide and breathe heavily. Agrippa felt cold. He felt the familiar clinical detachment of a mechanic examining a broken engine. Before Trent could recover his posture, Agrippa moved. He didn't throw a haymaker. He didn't wind up. He simply pivoted his hips, transferring power from the ground through his core and into a short, devastatingly crisp right cross. The punch traveled exactly 8 inches. It connected with the sweet spot of Trent's jaw, transferring maximum force through the bone and into the vestibular system of the inner ear. The sound was sharp and terrible. like a heavy wooden bat striking a wet sandbag. Trent's brain slammed against the inside of his skull. The lights didn't simply go out. The entire electrical grid shut down. His eyes rolled back. His knees gave way, and he dropped straight onto the concrete path like a falling timber. He didn't put his hands out to break the fall. He was unconscious before his face struck the pavement. Silence crashed over the playground. For 2 full seconds, nobody moved. The 4 remaining bullies stared at Trent's limp body, unable to understand the physics of what they had just witnessed. The tired, broken-looking old man hadn't even appeared to swing hard. Trent had simply been standing there. Then he wasn't. Agrippa didn't admire what he'd done. He was already resetting, bringing his right hand back to his cheek while extending his left slightly to control the distance. His eyes bypassed Trent completely and locked onto the skinny kid with the neck tattoo, the one most likely to panic and swing. "What the fuck?" the skinny kid finally screamed, his voice cracking. Panic overrode self-preservation. He lunged forward, throwing a wildly telegraphed right hook aimed somewhere near Agrippa's ear. It was an amateur punch, heavy and slow, driven by emotion instead of technique. Agrippa slipped it with a tiny movement of his head. The punch sailed past his ear, carrying the kid's momentum completely off-center. As the kid stumbled into empty space, Agrippa stepped forward. He drove a vicious left hook into the kid's liver. It wasn't a headshot. It was worse. A liver shot doesn't knock you out. It paralyzes you. It sends a massive shock through the nervous system, causing blood pressure to drop instantly. The skinny kid gasped with a horrible sucking sound. His eyes bulged. His skin turned ash white, and his legs completely gave out. He collapsed onto the ground, curling into a tight fetal position and clutching his right side, unable to breathe, a silent scream carved across his face. 2 down, 4 seconds. Agrippa stepped back, opening his stance while keeping the remaining 3 in his field of vision. His breathing remained even, slow, and measured through his nose. He wasn't even sweating. The transformation was complete. He was no longer the exhausted father sitting in the park. He was an apex predator standing in a yard full of sheep. The third man, a heavy-set kid wearing a backward baseball cap, realized too late that they were completely out of their depth. But adrenaline is a stupid chemical. Instead of running, he tried to tackle Agrippa, lowering his head and charging forward like a high school linebacker. Agrippa welcomed the momentum. He didn't try to stop the heavy kid. He stepped off the center line, grabbed the back of the kid's neck with his right hand in a brutal clinch, and drove his left knee straight upward. Bone met bone with a sickening crack. The knee caught the charging kid squarely on the bridge of his nose. His forward momentum drove his own face into Agrippa's kneecap. Blood sprayed in a sudden bright arc across the concrete. The kid released a garbled cry and fell backward onto the grass, both hands clutching his injured face as he rolled in agony. 3 down. Agrippa didn't pursue. He re-established his base, his hands raised in a loose, relaxed guard. He looked at the final 2. They stood near the sandbox, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming violence. The swagger was gone. The cruelty was gone. All that remained was raw, unfiltered terror. They looked at Trent, lying unconscious on the concrete. They looked at the neck tattoo kid, still unable to breathe. They looked at the heavy kid bleeding heavily into the grass. Then they looked at Agrippa. His face was completely blank. His eyes were like dead black stones. He took one slow step toward them. "Are we done?" Agrippa asked. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the park, it sounded like thunder. The 2 remaining bullies said nothing. They didn't even check on their friends. They turned and ran, scrambling up the grassy hill so quickly that they tripped over each other, leaving behind their dirt bike, their friends, and their pride. Agrippa watched until they disappeared over the crest of the hill. Only then did he release a slow, controlled breath. He unclasped his hands and shook them out, feeling the familiar ache return to his knuckles. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain in his lower back was already creeping back in to replace it. He didn't look at the three groaning bodies on the ground. He slowly turned, the predatory grace disappearing and once again being replaced by the stooped shoulders of a tired man. He looked to Larry down to the sandbox. Larry was still sitting there. His yellow dump truck had fallen from his hands. His large, dark eyes were wide as he stared at his father. Agrippa's heart, which hadn't once raced during the fight, suddenly hammered against his ribs. A sickening wave of guilt washed over him. He had tried to protect his son, but he'd exposed him to the very monster he'd worked so hard to keep buried. Agrippa wiped his hands on his jeans, suddenly terrified of what Larry saw when he looked at him. "Larry," Agrippa said, his voice cracking. He took a hesitant step forward, suddenly feeling awkward and enormous. "Larry, It's okay." Larry stared at the bodies, then back at his father. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He reached downstairs, picked up his yellow dump truck, stood, and walked over to Agrippa. Larry reached out his small hand and wrapped his fingers around Agrippa's thick, calloused thumb. "Time to go home?" Larry asked quietly. Agrippa looked down at his son, feeling a lump the size of a golf ball forming in his throat. He gently squeezed the little hand. "Yeah, buddy," Agrippa whispered. "Time to go home?" Agrippa didn't reach his truck before the distant rising wail of sirens cut through the interstate's hum. Someone in the nearby brick apartment complex had undoubtedly seen the confrontation. Or, more likely, they'd witnessed its sudden, explosive conclusion. When you put three human beings onto concrete in less than 10 seconds, it tends to attract attention. Agrippa stopped at the edge of the parking lot. His 2011 Ford F-150, rusted around the wheel wells and covered in sawdust, sat 30 yards away. Running was what criminals did. Running could turn a straightforward case of self-defense into an evasion charge. Agrippa wasn't a criminal. He was simply a father who had run out of pavement. He opened the passenger side door of the truck. The hinges squealed in protest.